Welcome to the Chattanooga Depression Care Collective member interview series. I'm Regina from Wellspring, and my world is all about helping people get out of the pit. And today I'm here with Meg Freeman from Organically Human. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited to learn more about what you do, who you are, how it helps with depression, and why you do it. So wherever you want to jump in, I'm following your lead.
Okay. So thank you, Regina, for the introduction. I'm Meg Freeman, and I am an end-of-life doula with Organically Human. And who I am, I'm a complex human, just as we all are. I have always sought meaning in everything that I do. And, you know, what's the meaning here? How can I dig deeper? And for me, that turned out to be showing up for people in many spaces that people mostly would avoid. So when things were very difficult or challenging, sometimes people don't know what to say, and that's a human reaction, and it's valid. But what I've always been drawn to is being a listener, being a nurturer, being a communicator, and trying to hear between the words of what someone's really saying and what they're feeling. And since a young child, I've always done that, of course, have grown in many ways of doing that, especially being an empath. I was innately that as well and still am. But I will say now I am a person, especially in this work, I'm an empath with boundaries.
Ooh.
And I can sit in someone's space really deeply and profoundly, but then know that their pain is not my pain, and it's not my job to take that from them. It's not my job to fix it. So I guess what I'm trying to say of who I am is this work is really woven into who I am. So I'm doing external work for others, but at the same time, I am internally working on myself and what others can teach me and what I can teach them. So it's a very reciprocated thing that really helps me process and understand and be curious about how we can be a human in this world.
So I'm hearing that you are a listener who's willing to go into spaces that a lot of people tend to avoid because they're hard, and specifically that end-of-life space.
Yes.
So tell us more about what the end-of-life doula is.
Yes. So an end-of-life doula, by definition, is a non-medical person that assists individuals and families holistically that are facing end-of-life issues, that have been diagnosed with a terminal illness, that are experiencing grief and bereavement, or individuals that are experiencing mortality issues and grappling with, what will all happen for us, and trying to understand that more and center in on how we want to live our lives and what we want to put our energy and efforts towards. And a lot of what this work does as an end-of-life doula, I'm helping people really hone in on what's important to them in their lives. Whether this is the individual that is dying, whether it is the family or the circle of support, we are really trying to capture the joy within that person's life. But we are also trying to understand what we might need to talk about, what we might need to deal with. And sometimes that shows up as emotional work. Sometimes that shows up as logistical work. Some people are very worried about making sure that they've got all their affairs in order, that they've done all the documentation, that they've wrote their letters or cards or whatever that makes them logistically feel like they can transition gracefully out of this world. That is what I help with. So emotional, logistical, end-of-life doulas can also have very unique offerings based on their own skill set. So some of those for me look like remembrance poems writing has always been a way for me to channel my own grief and processing the world around me, and offering that to individuals and families of these little snippets and beautiful nuggets that I pick up on with my time with them. That's something I offer. And also farewell living gatherings and being a mortality guide and grief companioning as well. And something I'm more recently offering is also speaking engagements, because having conversations like you and I are having are very important for just to provide an open space to be able to say the hard things and also feel like you're being seen and heard, but also that someone can't fix it for you, that work and those things are in you. It just needs to be mirrored back out of you, and that's also what I help with.
So you help people die well, and not just the person dying, but like the community. Like you said the word transition. Mm-hmm. And so we talk about big transitions in life, like getting married, buying a car, graduating college, things like that. But we don't often talk about dying.
Right.
And so you're like, hey, this is a transition, and
Yes.
I'm here to help do it with all the ways, the logistical ways and the emotional ways.
And I think those are really beautiful examples of how those things are teaching us how to die. So we have these transitions, we have these different things that we grieve that maybe aren't related to a physical death, mm-hmm. but they are related to losing something and having something for a certain duration of time and then no longer having it anymore in a tangible way. And so it's almost like these things that we're talking about and we're learning throughout the human experience is preparing us to be able to hopefully die well. And that's why talking about these death and dying and talking about our fears and anxieties and maybe depression towards it, it's really important to have them so that when our time is coming or we're facing that with someone else in our lives, mm-hmm. it doesn't erase that all those feelings are there, but it makes it to where we can hold it all at once.
Can you tell a story about a time when you saw somebody die well? Because like that's one of those things where it's like, if I don't know what that looks like, what does it even mean to die well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's hard to, especially because it's hard to define that die well or a good death.
Yeah,
and it's because a lot of us, we think of, oh, that's when maybe some people had time to prepare. You know, maybe this person was diagnosed with a terminal illness and they had this time to be able to accomplish or do and say and feel the things that they want to feel.
Yeah.
Death also comes suddenly and unexpectedly. And so when we talk about dying well, it's more knowing that death can come at any time, whether it's a sudden diagnosis or sadly driving down the street. Mm-hmm. And knowing that having death in mind as our teacher will help us be able to live better so that when our death does come, whether it's known or expected or suddenly, dying well is making sure that you lived every day in a way that you can leave even if it's suddenly or unexpectedly. And so a lot of my work has been with people that have had a known diagnosis. And for a lot of those people that have that time, there is an amount of time where they get to become more deeper and in tune with their own selves and with the world around them. Someone particularly told me that they have, in their end-of-life journey, that they were able to know people on a much deeper level than they had before, because people were choosing to be open and vulnerable.
Real.
But it's also because she was too.
She's like, okay, this is the space I'm going to hold now.
She was a big educator of wanting people to sit with her in this journey, because she was an advocate for seeing this as a transition that we will all go through.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing is we do know that, but how do we apply it? You know, and there's a difference.
Yeah.
And so dying well is really about having death in mind every day. And what you can do for the people around you to help ease that and to help ease yourself so that it can feel like I lived that life that I'm okay with and I'm happy with and I'm content with because I thought about my own death and thought about maybe the people around me. So I can go into what I would envision my own death to be and what many people might envision. You know, if it's going to happen, what would you prefer, right? I prefer to be in my home. I prefer to be around loved ones. And thankfully, I've been able to witness that in other people's deaths.
Yeah.
I've been able to witness the stillness of the last breath. And I've been able to witness so much life and so much life lived in that last breath, but in a way that they were at peace. They were at peace with what they had to do, and they had to leave.
So it sounds like living with death in mind is about like an honest look. Like, you know, this is going to happen and you're okay with however it happens because you're doing the best you can where you are as you go through.
Yeah.
This is really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I want to get more into the idea of death as teacher because I often talk about depression as teacher. And it sounds like these are both things that are here to help us learn about depth.
Yeah.
Yeah, so tell us more about death as teacher.
Yeah. Death as teacher is what I'm leaning into every day. For me, and how I think it can really help others when we try to reframe, right? Take this really scary thing that we don't like the way it feels, we don't like the way it sounds, you know, use imagery and visualization of what you think death, you know, looks like. And I've battled my own death anxiety, so it's not that it's not scary.
Yeah.
It's not that it's not these things, because it is. But having it be your teacher really helps you hone in on being very present with the very mundane things. You know, it's the smell of my coffee, the certain coffee that I like to make every morning, or the leaf falling so gently from the tree.
So death as teacher helps you really get in touch with like the sensory experience of being human.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, oh, this is what I smell, this is what I see, this is what I feel.
Yeah. I think death as teacher reminds you of how alive you are and how human you are, and that there's also a lot of discomfort, but there's also a lot of comfort, you know.
It's the full catastrophe, as
Yeah.
John Kabat-Zinn says. It's all of it.
Yeah. And I think it reminds us what we actually want to spend our time doing.
Ooh.
And who we want to focus our time on, you know, who we want to love, how we want to be loved, how we want to be remembered, what we want to put out into this world that makes us feel purposeful. I think when we have those things in mind, the foundation is death as teacher.
So it's about welcoming this fact that like death is the contrast to life in a way that gives it meaning.
Yes.
Ooh.
Yes.
I can see why you really like this space, because it's so gritty and meaningful. It's like, oh, like, do tell me how you actually want to live. Do tell me about your purpose.
Yeah.
And like, that's my favorite stuff too.
Death is about life. So it's sometimes I'm like, I'm a death doula, but I'm also a life doula, because we are focusing on the life so that we can have a good death.
It's interesting, like, I want to hear more about why your business is called Organically Human, and then talking about like what it means to be human, and how as humans we kind of bop along until we have these realization moments. And so death is often a realization moment for a lot of people. It's like, oh, I know when my cousin died, I was like, whoa. And he died when he was 26, and I'm 26 now. And I'm like, oh, I'm older than he will ever be. And just like what that does for me thinking about my life.
Yeah.
and what it means to be human.
Yeah. And that's a lot of, organically human, that I actually had that name in my life with an outlet for my writings on an Instagram many years ago. And at the time, it meant almost the same thing. It just wasn't applied in the same way. So organically human was then, as a baby, more normalizing being a human and having a human experience tied with all these different layers and facets of emotions and feelings and processing and depths and all of that.
Yeah.
And so I kept the name Organically Human and applied to death work because to me it has always been, normalizing this human experience, and that includes death.
I love that we're both out here like normalizing death and depression, and like, yes, here we are, humans.
Yeah, and to your point about, being faced with death is when you start thinking about it, right? So I think the purpose of Organically Human is let's go ahead and think about it.
Here's me facing you with death is the fact that I'm here and I've been with people as they've died, and I do this professionally.
Yeah.
And the invitation is, do you want to come face death with me? And
Yeah.
like, even if you're not actively dying right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so that's why a lot of my offerings are, hey, if you want to have these conversations, let's have them now. I mean, sooner the better. Because I think for me personally, the processing journey of death, it was to where I knew it could occur. We all know it can occur. But I think actually seeing how we apply that to our lives is really what formulated Organically Human in the way that it is. I wanted it to be inviting. I wanted it to feel natural. I didn't want it to feel, oh, this is only about death. And it is, but it's about life. And so I Organically Human, it, invites us to normalize the human journey and transitional stage of birth and death, and knowing that what we're going to do in the in-between is so important of how we leave this world. And there can be enlightenment in our last days. There can be growth, and I think sometimes
beauty too,
and beauty, sacredness. I think sometimes we lose sight of death being what it is, which is a very hard, difficult, devastating thing, but not losing sight that it also can be sacred, and it also can be something we can learn from, and it also can be to where we join it hand in hand and let it have a seat at the table also.
I love how if you're truly living, you can't not talk about things like death and depression, where it's like, oh yeah, this is the fullness.
Yeah.
So I want to hear more about why you're in the Depression Care Collective. Tell me about how your work as a death doula helps with depression.
Yeah, so I know I've touched a lot on, how important it is to have open conversations. And what I provide is a neutral, non-judgmental, non-biased space for people to be able to do that as they process the death or dying of a loved one or themselves. And that, since we're talking about such a important and heavy subject, such as death, there are a lot of emotions and feelings that come along with death, such as depression. And if I'm able to walk hand in hand with individuals and families, it doesn't fix anything, but it does ease it, and it can be preventative maintenance for feelings of depression, anxiety, going to a point of needing, needing something more. So it's almost kind of like, okay, if we do this maintenance, maybe we can openly talk about these depressing feelings and anxieties that are tied to the death, right? So it's what's causing it, and getting to the root of it, which is my loved one is dying or I'm dying.
Mm-hmm.
And with all of that, what I think is very important for me to bring to the Chattanooga Depression Collective is my offering of grief companioning. And what grief companioning is providing that space and for grief to just flow however it needs to, and to have someone who is a very active listener, but also uses the technique of mirroring, because the goal is to empower the individual to know that they have all of it in them. It just needs to be articulated back to where they then feel, okay, I can take these next steps, And so I'm basically walking alongside as a companion, listening. And a lot of times it can look like helping with imagery and visualization exercises. And sometimes imagining kind of what we were touching on, like imagining death or grief.
Yes.
And kind of what it looks like. I've referred to it sometimes grief looking like this big blob where all the colors and textures and things, none of it makes sense, right? But if we poke it a little bit, maybe we can understand what's going on. And maybe we can understand we need to let a little bit of that grief, that love out and sit with it. And then sometimes you need to take space from it too. And I've seen it be very empowering for individuals to either say, hey, I love this service as an as needed. It's been so wonderful. And I'm if I feel like I need a companion in my grief, I offer it as an as needed as well. But also it's for people to take next steps, whether that be with a therapist, whether that be with more somatic techniques, whether that be with yoga, or whether that be with all these things. It's kind of saying, because sometimes it can be very overwhelming to even invest too much in all of these things. So it's kind of like this little baby starter point to just say what you need to say. I'll let it go how it needs to go. I will hear you. I will listen to you. And you don't need to feel like I'm neutral, And I think I've seen a lot of people have so much success of it talking with friends and family, but sometimes having that separation and having someone not be so in it. I've seen a lot of success with that.
I'm thinking about like a giant tangle of necklaces, like when all the chains get all tangled up and you're trying to untangle them and you're like, and like your friends and family are part of that tangle oftentimes, and you're someone who comes in and you like put the table under the chain to take the tension off, and then you can start playing with all of those necklaces.
Tension. Yeah.
And it's also making me think of how like Francis Weller talks about one form of depression is compressed grief. So it's like when you have all this grief that has got so tangled up and you don't know what to do with it, that can look like depression. That can be depression. And so having somebody to help untangle the compressed grief is so helpful.
And I think too, it's a matter of giving someone permission to be slow. Be slow with their grief, because just like death and grief, we are in this fast-paced society where, if when a death occurs, okay, we'll give some space, but then, you're expected to go back to work pretty soon. You're expected to 180 back into life, to where it does cause a barrier of being able to fully process what occurred, and which can then cause a lot of tangled up grief that wasn't met with, that you didn't get to sit with. And so if we're able to at least offer things like this, it's like we can provide a little bit of space and a little bit of stillness and a little bit of slowness to say, hey, it's okay to be still with your grief, and it's okay to know that you might need to slow down, and it's okay, all these permission invitations I think are very important for our society.
your presence, like the space you hold in the world, like inherently is like, oh yeah, it's okay to take the time you need to take with your grief. And I am a living testament to that. And I'm just going to show up in your space and hold that as long as you need me to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Without trying to fix you, because you're not broken and I'm not here to fix you. I'm
That's
just
right.
here to hold it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we'll see if we change it, if we poke it a little bit, if we untangle it a little bit, how does it evolve?
Because I've gotten questions too, is when is my grief going to be over, and when will I know when I'm healed from the grief. And grief is very complex, and there's not an over of grief. It's more how can I be with the grief but navigate with it, because it's not about solving it and fixing it. It's about, I am changed, I am different. Something that happened to me that's different, I am now different. And so how do I channel that and companion my own grief to be able to know I can be both. I can be with my grief, but I can also know that I can still live a wonderful, beautiful life. And knowing that there's not a timeline, I think could be really relieving. We set a lot of goals and objectives and all these things of when we meet, certain things, and that's wonderful in certain aspects of life. But when it comes to grief, it can show up and look a lot differently 1 year and 5 years later. It's not that it's not that it's over, it just is showing up differently, and knowing that you can grow with it can be very comforting thought.
Yeah, it goes back to that, like, living well and dying well is being able to change when you're changed. Like, you're different now, like you said, and being able to do that gracefully.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people respond very well with understanding, oh, I am different. So what routines could I do differently maybe that match this different that I'm feeling?
So you do a lot of work of, like, helping these intangible things become tangible, and they're like, oh, this is how I think about my death daily, or like, oh, this is how I untangle my grief daily. Oh, this is how I grow alongside my grief. This is how I companion my grief.
Yeah.
And not in this, like, abstract way, but a very specific and personalized way.
Yes.
Amazing.
Yes.
Thank you for doing this work.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I can tell how much you care.
I do. I do.
Yeah.
It's an honor and it's a privilege. It's beautiful, it's sacred. A lot of people will say, isn't it depressing? And that's a very normal societal reaction.
Yep.
For anyone that works in death or depression and hospice and all these different things that touch really hard human things.
I feel like we need another conversation where we talk about the difference between, like, heartbreaking and depressing.
Yes.
Where it's like so much of it is just heartbreak, and it's like, how do we learn to hold the heartbreak?
And that's the word I would use, because it is heartbreaking. But also I'm able to look death in the face and say, wow. And for these people that I get to work with and say, look at the life that they lived. Look at the time we got to spend. Look at all that they shared with me, and say,
wow.
They feel they are ready. If it's going to happen, that my job is to help ease that transition, because I'm not able to withhold that from happening.
Yeah, it's gonna happen, and you get to show up and say, wow, look at how cool this is.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah. So I want to recap a little bit, and then I want to know if you have any closing things you want to say. So Meg Freeman, Organically Human, End-of-Life Doula, and Grief Companion. So showing up in the death spaces, learning, like, death as teacher, learning from death daily to influence how you live, to live well and to die well, however that means for any individual. And it helps with depression because of that relationship between grief and depression. And so having a companion for the grief helps with the depression.
That's right.
And you do it because you care about, like, going into those deep places. Yeah. Is there anything else you want people to know about you and your work?
Yeah. Why I do this work has everything to do with others and wanting to go into the depths of that and meet people where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not my job to tell them they should be somewhere else in their process. So I'm meeting them where they
Non-judgmental.
are. That's right. Why else I do this work is I experienced loss at a very young age. I was 12 and I lost my aunt. She was 28.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my most profound loss that caused me to contemplate that death is not just come for people that are elderly.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was my first contemplation of that. And so what I learned recently that was really profound is my aunt told my grandmother, her mother, that if she were to get better, and this was during her cancer journey, if she were to get better, that she really wanted to do something and she really wanted to help others. And I spoke to a stranger recently having an organic, beautiful conversation, and they asked me what I was grieving, and I said those words, you know, about my aunt, and that I really felt like her legacy that she didn't get to is woven into what I'm providing for my own legacy and to others in the world. And so that was a big connection moment for me of channeling her and her guiding me with my hands is her hands.
Mm.
And that was really profound. So I think it's really important to contemplate these big things, and that goes into a lot of legacy as well. You know, what we want to be remembered for, but also, you know, if we have people that did experience a sudden death and maybe their time was shorter, thinking of maybe what they would have wanted to do and how we can carry that out for them.
The insight that she had when she was very close to death and how that impacted your life is so juicy.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And my
Thank
heart
you.
is like, whoo.
Thank you.
So how can people find you?
I have my website, organicallyhuman-doula.com. I also am on Instagram, Organically Human Doula, and I'm also on Facebook and LinkedIn. So
Okay.
all social media platforms and my website.
Cool. And if they want to work with you, they can message you on any of them?
Yes. So my email, and I have a form and an email listed throughout my website. And either or is a wonderful way to contact me.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ta-da!